Welcome again from Partnership of Historic Bostons to Gail Golec, who has been a professional archaeologist for over 20 years, primarily working in the Middle Connecticut River Valley of New Hampshire and Vermont. And currently, Gail's a project archaeologist with Monadnock Archaeological Consulting. And she also writes and produces a history podcast called The Secret Life of Death, which I will put a link to in the chat so you can check it out. This is where she discusses the life and times of regular, often ignored people through the lens of historic New England cemeteries, old burying grounds. Since 2020, she's been a citizen archivist with the Recovering Black History of the Monadnock Region Research Project, which is sponsored through the Historical Society of Cheshire County and the Monadnock Center for History and Culture. So I'm going to hand that over to Gail, and she can get started.
Thank you all very much for coming to this presentation this evening, and thank you to Lori and Partnership for Historic Bostons for inviting me to present this research to everybody, and to Natalie for taking care of tech and making sure everything's running smoothly. So that's a huge weight off of my shoulders to have someone take care of all that. So thank you. And as we get going, to a special thanks to Ray Brooks, who is a family descendant of the Brooks family. As Lori said, he's going to be here. He's here with us tonight. He is going to be available after my presentation to take questions and talk about the research that he's done into his family history. And so if you have any questions for the family, Ray will be happy to field those at the end of the presentation. And finally, thank you to all of you for logging on and giving us your attention for an hour and a half on this very rainy, at least where I am, evening in the middle of March. And we've got a lot to get through, so I'm just going to jump right in. Maybe. There we go. So just a little background about the project that started all of this work. Prior to COVID, the Historical Society of Cheshire County, which is in Keene, New Hampshire, along with the Monadnock Center for History and Culture. These are two research entities that are located in the southwest corner of the state of New Hampshire. They began a project called Recovering Black History in the Monadnock region. And this project was and is, it's ongoing. It's a multi-year initiative to use citizen archivists to research African-American history in this region of the state, starting from the dates of 1730 to 1930. And one of the goals of this project is to establish a framework that people in towns in New Hampshire and Vermont and basically anywhere could use to research their own African-American histories. And this is particularly geared towards rural areas, which would have a little bit different needs historically for historic research than perhaps urban areas. They also are going to eventually be producing a publicly available database that's going to showcase all of this documentary paper trail that we've been accumulating on this project over these years on the Black citizens on this part of New Hampshire. And I was lucky enough to be part of this research project. Still am a part of the research project. And I got to work on families in the towns of Walpole, New Hampshire and Alstead, New Hampshire. And so this presentation the things I'll be talking about tonight is the result of my research in those towns. And so to orient everybody to the places that we're talking about, since we might have some people outside of the area who are attending tonight, this red star here in the middle of our map is basically the general location where the towns that we're going to be talking about are located. So again, Keene, if you're at all familiar with the area, Keene, New Hampshire is probably the biggest town / city in this whole area. And so we're talking about areas roughly 20 miles north of that. And we're also on a number of towns that are straddling both sides of the Connecticut River. So we're talking about towns in Vermont, towns in New Hampshire, the towns of Alstead, Langdon, and Walpole on the New Hampshire side, and Westminister and Rockingham on the Vermont side. And these are a nice little cluster of towns, like I said, on both sides of the Connecticut River. And the river here is the entire border between Vermont and New Hampshire. That's the Connecticut River. It comes down through western Massachusetts and then cuts through the middle of the state of Connecticut before outlets in Long Island Sound. And the Connecticut River itself actually plays a role in some of the things that we're going to be talking about tonight. So just remember that the Connecticut River, where it is in relation to these towns, file that back in your brain. We're going to come back to that at the end of the presentation. And so starting off, while we're looking at this map, I'll give you a little bit of a historical backdrop to tonight's presentation. When we talk about New England, think about New England, especially historically, we think of it as this solid, homogeneous mass with a solid, homogeneous history. But of course, it isn't, and it doesn't. Our study area, again, in and around this little red star here, this is in the uplands, the interior portion of New England. And this area is going to have a different history than places on the coast of New England, places farther south of New England. And just speaking in terms of history after the arrival of the Europeans, up here, our indigenous history is very different than what you see going on in southern New England. And our Euro-American history starts up here much later, really not until the 1730s at the very earliest, and really not in a very substantial way until the 1760s after the French and Indian War. But all of what happens in this area, in and around the areas we're going to be talking about tonight, is the direct result of all the things that are happening down here in southern New England, all of the things going on the coast and all of the things going on in southern New England, because those English people who start here on the coast and in southern New England around 1620, they're doing stuff down here. A few generations later, all of their descendants come up here and they start doing stuff. So getting back to this Recovering Black History project that got all of this research kicked off, the first records that we looked at in doing that research were the census, the federal census records. And they're really great for that because they have a standardized format for the most part. They're going to have a record for every town every 10 years. So they're really a good baseline to start accumulating information, start looking for names of people, and start looking at other personal, individual information about these people. And so this is where we got started with the Recovering Black History Project. The first federal census was taken in 1790. This record that we're looking at here, though, is for the 1820 federal census. And this is very nice. It's all typed up and you can see everything, read it very clearly. You can see all the nice little columns of things that they were the information that they were looking for. And so you have names of the heads of household over here, left to right. The next category, they're looking for free white males. And then under that, you see all of these columns. They represent different age categories for free white males. The next, free white females. And again, these same age categories beneath that. On the right-hand side, we do have columns for slaves. Unfortunately, slavery was still legal in some parts of the United States at this time, so they did include that information on the federal census. And then below that, we have male, female, and then the different age categories there. And on the far right, we have free colored persons. And then that is further broken down into males, females, and then again, all of those different age categories. So this 1820 census that we're looking at here is for the town of Westminster, Vermont. And I don't know if I can move this real quick. And as you can see from the top up here, it's missing all of those nice little categories that we saw on the printed off version, which is why I wanted to show you. Oftentimes in these early records like this, you'll have that be the case where the top part of the census record isn't included in the one that you're looking at, unfortunately, which makes it a little difficult if it's a little messy to follow things through, but it's a pretty common thing. So on the left-hand side, we've got the heads of household, then we've got the categories for free males, category for free females. because we don't have the slave category here in Vermont because slavery was illegal here. And so these columns on the right-hand side, all of these columns are going to be for free persons of color, and then male and female, males here and then females on that side. And so I like this record because it's very interesting to me for a couple of reasons. First of all, here in Westminster in 1820, we see actually quite a few households that have people of color living in them. We have up at the top, oops, is that? There we go. We have Caleb Clapp has a person of color in this household. John Lee listed here, another interesting one. John Lee is actually their household is all persons of color, which is very interesting. We have William Bradley, Josiah Willard. Oops, I'm gonna have to move this again. And at the very bottom, a man named Sylvester Sage. And so if we thinking about this, this is actually quite a few. This is a lot. This is more than the average for a rural area at this time to have this many people of color in a population in a rural town like this. That Westminster had roughly 1,900 people. So this is very interesting and a neat place to jump off and do our research from. So going back to this, or staying with this 1820 federal census record here, we're going to zoom in on this record up at the top for a woman named Susanna Reed. So Susanna she's a woman as head of household. That's a little bit unusual, and we can see looking across on the rest of the census, Susanna's household is also all people of color, which is very interesting. And not only that, they're all women. So in this particular household, we have a woman, all women of color in this category, 14 to 26 years old. That's what this category represents. We have the next one, 26 to 45 years old, a woman. And then finally, in this category over here, a woman 45 years or older. And we're guessing that's probably Susanna in that category. So this is great. As far as our research goes, we have a document that gives us a name of somebody and some age ranges for other people in her household, something that we can jump off of and start doing some research on. So where else do we find any information about Susanna or anybody else named Reed in the records? In Westminster, Vermont, 7 years after that census was taken, we see a woman named Eunice Reed, and she is marrying a man named Montgomery Brooks. Now, this particular record doesn't say anything about these people being persons of color or that they're even related to Susanna. This is something that we've been able to establish through other records, but that Eunice is one of Susanna Reed's daughters. And she's probably even listed in that 1820 census under one of those tick marks that we saw. And so this record is starting to give us some more context about the family. Eunice is marrying a man named Montgomery Brooks. And so now we've got another name that we can start looking up information about in the records. And another thing that I'll point out that's worth remembering is that their wedding ceremony was performed by a man named Sylvester Sage. He was a minister, a Congregationalist minister in the town of Westminster. If you'll remember, when we were looking at the 1820 census, Sylvester Sage was one of the people who had a person of color living in his household. And so that's really interesting to me too. And we're going to come back to that. So file that little bit of information away, back with the information about the Connecticut River, because that's going to come back together at the end for us. And so 3 years after that census was, or the wedding happened in Westminster, we see in this 1830 census that Montgomery's name shows up in the town of Rockingham, Vermont. And actually, his name is not listed as Montgomery, it's Gomery Brooks. And I've sort of condensed the condensed that big page down so you could read across who is this is Gomery Brooks's record, and this is the record of all the people in his household, and these are all of those age range categories that we saw in that earlier the earlier census record. So we see that Gomery is the head of his own household in 1830. And something else that this record shows us, the family has moved. They were living in Westminster. By 1830, they're in a town of Rockingham. Rockingham isn't that far away from Westminster. It's a neighboring town, so they haven't moved that far. And this record also helps us fill in some gaps and corroborate those things that we were talking about with that marriage record from 1827. In this record, we can see that Gomery Brooks' household, they're all free persons of color. So this is corroborating that Montgomery Brooks was a person of color. There are 2 males under the age of 10, 1 male, 24 to 36 years. Presumably, this is probably Montgomery. We have 1 female, 10 to 24 years, 2 females, 24 to 36, one of them probably being his wife, Eunice. And then we have a female, 55 to 100 years. And she's, this is probably Eunice, or Eunice's mother, Susanna, who we saw in that very first 1820 census record. So going along in time, in between 1837 and 1838, anyway, the Brooks family had moved from Rockingham, Vermont. They've gone over the Connecticut River, and now they're living in the town of Langdon, New Hampshire. Again, not very far, but still a move nonetheless. So this record shows that the family had gone through some hard times while they were living in Langdon. They needed some financial assistance from the county as the result of, quote, a sickness in the family. And I have yet to investigate this. I'm hoping to find out some more information in town record that might elaborate as to what the situation was for the Brooks family while they were living in Langdon at the time. But it seems from at least the wording in this document, and knowing how the social safety net system of county assistance worked at that time, something was happening here. The sickness in this family, whether it was the entire family or maybe just affected Montgomery significantly, was bad enough that they were having trouble making ends meet. And so perhaps Montgomery couldn't work, and he was so sick he couldn't work, and they needed some help from the county there. Moving along, by 1840, the Brooks and Reed family, they have moved again. They've gone from Langdon to Alstead, New Hampshire. Again, this is the next town over. So again, not moving far, but they're still on the move. This is a theme that's going to keep coming back up. This record, we see that Montgomery, again, is the head of the household here. All of the people in his household are free colored persons, according to this record. We've got 3 males under the age of 10, 1 male between 36 and 55, probably Montgomery. We've got a female one female under the age of 10, 1 female 26 to 36, and 1 36 to 55. That's probably most likely his wife, Susanna. And what we don't see here is a record for Eunice's mother, Susanna, that we had surmised that she was living with them in the 1830s. So either she is living elsewhere by this 1840 census, or perhaps she's passed away in the intervening years. I haven't found a death record for her yet, though. I'm still looking. So as we continue on, moving along through time here, still in the 1840s, the Brooks family has moved again. And here we have records for the town of Walpole, New Hampshire, which is right next to Alstead, where they were living in 1840. And here we have, sadly, a record that's showing us that in 1842, a man named Gum Brooks had passed away in May of 1842. And so a couple of things about this record. This, if you think about it, this is the third incarnation of Montgomery's name that we've seen in official documentation. So he's been Montgomery in some records, he's been Gummery, and now we see his record as Gum. It's listed here. It shows that he is listed as Negro here in the record. And you'll notice that he's the only person in this record whose skin color is noted. Of course, everyone else is by default assumed to be white. This is how people thought of one of the ways that we see people's skin color and race being represented in historic records very often at this time. And the only other thing we see about him, his age, unknown. So this really gives you an idea of, or a window into this idea of the very transitory nature of the lives of these family members. The people taking the record here from Montgomery didn't seem to know a lot of personal details about him. They didn't really even know what his real full name was. They didn't even know how old he was when he passed away, but they sure knew he was Black. And in researching other town records here in Walpole from this time, there were apparently other Black families that were living in the town around the same time. Here we have a death record in Walpole for 1847. On March 27th, there is a one-year-old child, of a man named Joseph J. Lord, who they list as colored. So as we're going through these records, we're still finding more names to follow up on, which is really, really cool. We're starting to put a lot more pieces together of the details of what was going on in these rural towns in the 1840s and 50s. And you have to wonder, of course, since there are so few people of color in this region at this time, let alone in one town, are these families connected? Are they related? Can we find any connections between the Lords and the Brookses? And so when we go to the 1850 census in Walpole, we're still in the same town. This record cracks everything wide open for us. So here we have our friend. We have Eunice Brooks here again. She is the head of her own household here in Walpole. And unfortunately, the 1850 census records, they don't indicate how individuals within a household are related or related to one another, but we can safely assume that those people with the same last name are probably family members. So we have Eunice Brooks, we have a Thaddeus Brooks, Harriet, William, and James, and probably mother and children, right? And also within this same household, we have the same man who we saw in that previous record from 1847, Joseph Lord, and what appear to be two of his children, Elizabeth and George. There's also another adult male in the household named Elnathan Roberts, and a baby named Ella Farbs. So having all of this detail starts to help us make a lot of connections. Everything starts to become very clear in the record now. So if we dig around in the Brooks and the Lords and the Robertsons, we find out that yes, they are connected. They are actually related to each other. Joseph Lord is another one of Eunice's sons from a previous relationship. Joseph's wife sadly died sometime around the same time that the baby in Walpole died in 1847. So in 1850, here he is, a single father who has moved in with his mother and his half siblings, and they're working together. They're helping each other out. And again, this is another trend that we're starting to see, not just with the Brooks family here, but in a lot of the other families that we've been able to find information about in this Recovering Black History project, is that there are a lot of these extended intergenerational families often living together or very close to one another. And we've even been lucky enough to find some other specific information about the Lords and the Brookses while they were in Walpole. We have an excerpt here from a town history that was published in 1963 that says, quote, "Along the bank at the east end of this field, where it drops down toward the brook, one may still find foundations of the buildings where Negroes lived. They are said to have worked in the shoe shop and are listed in the 1850 census. Well, we were just looking at the 1850 census for Walpole, so clearly this record is talking about the Brookses, the Lords, and the Robertsons. And so now we know exactly where they lived while they were living in Walpole. We know where they worked, and we know what kind of work they were doing, which is really, really kind of cool and exciting. So this is a great reference in a lot of ways, but it's also kind of an odd one. And it's very telling, again, about how people of color are represented and presented in our historic records. Here we have all of this very specific information about this family. It's describing where they lived and where they worked, and it's even going so far as to say you can find their names on the 1850 census records. But the author here does not include those names. And you have to consider that as a very specific kind of erasure for Black people in our history. And we see this happen a lot. This is not an isolated incident. And this sort of the way that they are, the language that's used to talk about them in historic records like this, and the treatment of the actual information about Black people in this historic record, it contributes to this sense, well, of like, well, in these rural areas there were never really any Black people who lived here in our rural communities. But of course, just from looking at the things that we've talked about so far, we can see clearly that is not true. And so something that contributes to that concept, so this contributes to that concept that, well, Black people didn't really live, a lot of Black people didn't live in these rural communities, is something that I've touched on a little bit already, is that in this, as we see here in this case with the Brookses and the Lords, they moved around quite frequently. And so just based on the census records we've looked at, some marriage records and other vital statistics that we found so far, we've tracked the family starting down here in Westminster in the 1820s. By the 1830s, they have moved a little bit farther north to the town of Rockingham, Vermont. By 1838, they've gone across the river. They're living in the town of Langdon, New Hampshire. By the 1840s, they are in Alstead, just a little bit farther south of that. In the 1840s and the 1850s, they're living in the town of Walpole, New Hampshire. And then in the 1860s through the 1890s, they're back in Westminster, Vermont. So again, their lives are very transitory, and we've been able to see that they're moving about every 10 years, but they're likely moving more often than that. And again, this is something that isn't unique to the Reeds or the Brookses. This is a trend that we see with other Black folks and people of color in this area historically. And so you really start to get this sense that they existed in a very ironic kind of limbo in these areas, that maybe on the one hand, they are probably the only Black people that are living in a town at any given time. And so they would have been well known. But on the other hand, maybe they weren't known very well by other residents of these towns. And that in part might have been by design, by the families themselves. If you keep your head down, if you stay under the radar, people might leave you alone and let you live in peace. The Brooks and the Reed family were all too aware of the capricious nature of racism and bigotry. And so it was probably always in the back of their mind, how long was it going to be before someone would take issue with them over something and try to force them out of this town yet again. And so this plays a part in why it's often very hard to find a lot of information about people of color in the historic record, especially in rural areas. Which is a shame, especially for the Brookses, because their family have done some things for which they should be well known and celebrated. So here we have records for the 1860s. We're going forward in time. These are enlistment records for two of Eunice and Montgomery's sons. We have James and William Brooks. Both signed up for multiple tours during the Civil War. And as you can see here, they were both served in the famous 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment. And luckily, military records are very good and very thorough. So we actually have quite a bit of information about what these two did while they were in service. James was drafted from Vermont in 1863, but since there were no colored regiments in Vermont, so he went to Massachusetts to serve. In 1865, he contracted a skin disease that prevented him from walking very well, and so he received a discharge from the military. He would later marry, live in Rutland, Vermont, not far from Westminster, but eventually he would come back to the Westminster area. William was drafted in 1863, and he was shot and wounded in the Battle of Owsley in Florida. He returned to Westminster to recover from his wounds, and then he actually went back into service briefly after he had recovered before receiving a disability discharge. And sadly, he would suffer from the effects of those wounds for the rest of his life. And so up to the 1860s, we're following the family, and they've come back to Westminster, or at least some of the family members have. And from digging around in deed records, we found out that they actually owned land here in Westminster. We have deeds for the Reeds, the Brookses, and the Lords, all living in an area outside of the village of Gageville. So here is Bellows Falls, Vermont. Here's the Connecticut River here. And this whole area here is roughly the town of Westminster. Gageville is a village within the town of Westminster. And so this is very fun and interesting because what we've found in the deed records actually lines up with some local knowledge about this area. Alice Caggiano at the Westminster Historical Society over the years had heard information from old timers who referred to a specific place off of a road in town, here as we call it today, the Back Westminster Road. These old timers talked about a place that was known as Blackville or Enville. And supposedly this is where a family of Black people lived historically. And when we plotted the location of the Reeds, Brooks, Lord family land, that placed it exactly in that spot that the history said it would, that the oral history said it would on Back Westminster Road. So it corroborates that earlier that record from locals too. And as I said, there are deeds here in this part of town going back to 1859, which is pretty early. And the land itself that the family owned was really only totaled about 4 or 5 acres. And honestly, most of that was not very good land. And just a fraction of that 4 or 5 acres was really flat enough to have any kind of buildings on or gardens or anything like that. And furthermore, this not so great piece of land was divided up amongst the siblings or the children of Thaddeus or of Eunice and Montgomery. So Thaddeus Brooks, James, William, their sister Martha, and Joseph Lord all owned a portion of that 4 or 5 acres. And then over the next few generations, each one of those little pieces was again divided up amongst their children. So at a certain point, people in the family only owned maybe half acre or a quarter acre, or sometimes even less, of pretty poor land to begin with. But owning land was an incredibly important thing for Black folks at this time. Not only did it give them an actual place to settle down, as opposed to having to move around from town to town like they were for the previous 20 or 30 or more years, they actually had a piece of property that they owned that they could live on. And it was also important because land doubled as a source of collateral for them. Black people could not get loans from banks at this time. And you see that reflected in the deeds. We see a lot of these deeds are where the land has been put up as collateral to get loans, and these are private loans. These are loans to their friends, to their neighbors, and to other family members. And this is an important part of how they got by living here at this time. And so moving on in time, by the 1870s, now we have the extended family pretty much all living, it seems all living at least at some point in that 4 or 5 acres up in Westminster. And we see that their children are going to school. We have a photograph here of the Gageville School, number 14, that was lent to us by Brad Purrington. So thank you, Brad. This photograph is dated between 1874 and 1880, and all the girls in the school are on the left-hand side, and all the boys are here on the right. And there's 2 little black boys in and amongst that little gang of surly-looking children there. And based on the date range of this photograph, these could be a couple of the Brooks family children. We're not exactly sure. Either Nathan or Frank Brooks. They are the children of Thaddeus and Mary. It could be one of them could be Herbert Brooks. He was the son of William and Abigail, or Willie, who was the son of James and Eliza. So all of these children would be the grandchildren of Eunice and Montgomery. And it's really kind of amazing to be able to see their faces. It takes your breath away to a certain extent. You really get attached when you're doing research like this into families, and you feel like you know that so much about them, but to actually be able to see their faces is really quite special and very powerful, and especially for rural Black folks, who there are so few photographic records of them in this early time period. To be able to say that we're pretty sure we know who these people are is pretty awesome. And what else are what else are they doing? We go to the town meeting minutes in Westminster, and the Brooks men are voting. This is a record from the 1876 election, and this giant list of names, these are all the men in the town of Westminster who cast their ballot that year. And I've highlighted the family names so we can see Thad Brooks, J.N. Williams, who was an in-law of the Brooks family, George Lord, and James Brooks. So really exciting to see that they are participating in their community. They're part of their community, and Black men are exercising their right to vote. This is pretty cool to see. And we also have evidence of other jobs that they were doing in and around Westminster. This is a photograph of Henry Wood's wood shop in Westminster Station, which is about 1895. And there are two Black men in this photograph. And again, based on the approximate ages of them, they look like they're probably in their 20s or their 30s. They're not old men, but they're certainly not teenagers either. Based on the date, their age and the date of that photograph, this could be they could be members of the Brooks family, either Nathan or Frank. These would have been possibly the 2 little boys that we saw in the photograph of the school. It's possible it's Herbert Brooks, who was also a candidate for the school photograph over there before, or it could be one of their cousins, George or Wallace Williams. They were also living here in and around here at the family land at that time too. And looking at some other town records, we have town reports from Westminster that shows us that a number of the Brooks men did work for the town. They worked on things like they worked on the roads, and we have evidence here in the 1887 census shows us that the town paid William for whitewashing and calcimening, that's a mouthful, calcimening the walls of one of the schools. He was paid $7 for that work. We also see here too that from these records of the town that some of the members of the Brooks family needed a little help from time to time, and to cover things like food and medical care. And in this case, in 1886, to cover the cost of the funeral services for Mrs. Brooks, and this would be Mary Jackson Brooks, who was the wife of Thaddeus. And Thaddeus in particular seemed to have a very difficult life at times. He was a landowner, certainly. He seemed to have his extended family around him most of the time. But some records indicate that he was born with some kind of physical infirmity, and he was also listed as a manual laborer. And so I can imagine that having a physical infirmity would have made doing labor very hard for him at certain periods. And that, of course, would have had an impact on his family. And especially as he grew older and perhaps more infirmed, he would have needed more and more help. And perhaps it got to the point where he needed more help than his family was able to provide for him. Because sure, they had land and they had homes and they had family, a strong network of family around them in Westminster, but life for them was pretty tough. Going back to that death record for Mary Brooks, the wife of Thaddeus, in 1866, we have a record here that tells us she committed suicide by drinking ammonia, and apparently she didn't die right away, which is really almost unbearable to think about what she went through. And so Mary is buried in this plot here with the family plot in the East Parish Cemetery in Westminster with her other family members. And I like cemeteries. I love cemeteries. So of course I went and had to look around. And something I noticed as I was looking around at the different family gravestones is that between the 1880s and the 1890s, there were a lot of deaths in the Brooks family. And I can't say whether it was more or less than the general public, but certainly it was a lot for one family to have to endure. And so we start to see things as the 1880s and 1890s draw in, that things are changing for the family, as we'll see in later records here. So by the end of the 1890s, Thaddeus, one of the brothers, he passes away in 1897. Later that year, from newspaper accounts tell us that there was a complaint lodged with Dr. Betty, who was the health officer of Westminster, about a public nuisance in Blackville. And he understands that he has ordered to be abated at once. Not exactly sure what this is referring to yet. One of the things I'm going to go back and see if I can find something more specific about what this is referring to. But we also see in just the next year in another newspaper article that the police are called out to the family property for an arrest of one of the family members. So we sort of get this impression that as the 1900s close in on the 1900s, things are starting to perhaps decline in conditions up at their family area there. And so it's also around the same time that we see other family members starting to move away from Westminster, looking for options elsewhere in New England. And by 1902, the last bit of that family property up in Westminster is finally sold off. So knowing all of this stuff is really great. We have a wonderful picture painted, all these details about the Brookses and the Reeds and the Lords and their family and their connection and what they were doing in New Hampshire and Vermont. And we understand that stuff very well. And certainly there are, as I mentioned, there are still some things that we want to follow up on and get more information on. But really, the whole story of the family starts to illuminate even more when we go farther back in time and we go to a different place in New England. So remember at the beginning, I told you there were a few things I wanted you to remember to come back to later. So one was talking about the Connecticut River, and the other was about in Westminster named Sylvester Sage. He was the man who married Eunice Reed and Montgomery Brooks. So let's follow up on that. So we're going to jump on a sailboat. We're going to sail 120 miles south on the Connecticut River from our study area up here. That's out of the way. So here's where all the family lived in Vermont and New Hampshire in the 1800s. We are going to sail down. Boy, I just cannot find a place to put this that is not in the way. sail down the Connecticut River here, and we're going to go to a place called Middletown, Connecticut. And we're also going to go back to the 17th century. So at this time, this whole region of New England, as all parts of New England were homelands to various indigenous groups. And this southern part of New England here, because their proximity to where the first Europeans made contact, the first settlements here in Boston in 1620, they had made first contact in this area, and that kind of spread out to other parts along the coast here. And so even though the first official settlement of the English in this part of Connecticut doesn't really happen until the 1850s, the English have been exerting their influence either directly or indirectly in this area for over 30 years at that point. And because of that, the indigenous populations here in southern New England had really their lives had been thrown into chaos, basically. They had been ravaged by the Pequot War in the 1630s early on, suffering mass population die-offs from the war, from disease and starvation. Their kinship networks had been disrupted as they had been displaced by the English. A lot of their traditional homelands had been continually encroached upon by the English, and the English settlements as they move farther and farther inland, pushing, exerting pressure on all of the indigenous people as the English moved. And so because of all this chaos and instability, we have some of the indigenous people, they just leave this part of New England altogether. Some of them go up north into central New England. Some of them go all the way up into Canada. Some of them go west into New York. But there are some that stay. They stay there in southern New England. Their descendants are still there today. But their way of life throughout the 17th and 18th century has been dramatically impacted by the presence of the English. And at this point, indigenous people are generally confined to these English-approved settlements. They're encouraged to turn to farming as opposed to relying on the hunting and gathering that they traditionally had. And a lot of them converted to Christianity, congregationalism for the most part in this area. And they did this as a way to gain acceptance to a certain extent and some of the protections of English society at that time. But this was not a reciprocal relationship between the English and indigenous people, even the ones that had converted to Christianity, because the English really had it in their ethos to, quote, civilize indigenous people. And so they were requiring them to basically give up everything about their traditional way of life and become English. And that was everything from how they gathered food, how they interacted with one another, and how they utilized their lands. And this life in English society under English rules really didn't work well for indigenous people, unfortunately. Many of them over time went into debt with the English, and the only thing they had to barter with was land that they owned. And so they sold, a lot of times would sell their land to the English to whom they were indebted to get out from under that debt. And those who couldn't sell land or didn't have any land to sell often were put into service, either to service with the English, which they would call indentured servitude, but a lot of times essentially became outright enslavement for the most part. And of course, this worked great for the English. They didn't have to pay for the labor, but there came a point where they even ran out of indigenous people to put into service for them. This unpaid service, notably. And so that's where what's happening in Middletown, Connecticut, becomes important. In the 17th and 18th century, Middletown is this very large and prosperous port city on the Connecticut River. And because it imports a lot of goods from a lot of places around the Atlantic, but they're also one of their more lucrative trading efforts have to do with the transatlantic slave trade. That's really how Middletown makes its name. And again, in part because there are just fewer and fewer, the English have come to rely on this system of enslavement or servitude of indigenous people. But when there aren't as many to utilize, they then turn to bringing enslaved people from Barbados starting in the 1660s. So all of this is a very long-winded way of setting this next part of our story up, because as a result of all of this historic thing, all this historic stuff happening down here in Middletown, Connecticut, this area of New England has a higher than average, a pretty substantial indigenous population, much higher than other places in New England. And because of the transatlantic slave trade, they have a higher than average population of formerly enslaved people and enslaved people in the 1700s. And so what do you think happens when 100 plus years after all of this, in the mid to late 1700s, when the descendants of all of those early English settlers on the Connecticut River move up to the Connecticut River and into New Hampshire and Vermont? Well, not only do the white Anglo-American people come up to settle these towns up in the Connecticut River Valley, but they also bring with them people of color. These are the descendants of the enslaved people trafficked from Barbados and the indigenous people from southern New England. And as serving in people's households down there, and they come up into places like Westminster, Vermont, and they come up to places like Walpole, New Hampshire, and we're guessing this is how the Reeds and the Brookes and the Lords also make their way from Connecticut, from southern New England up here into up into New Hampshire and Vermont. So I've made two little charts here. We have this is both for the town of Westminster, Vermont. So census records for 1800 and census records for 1820. We're going back to that census record again. And on the far left-hand side, we have the names of the heads of household for 1800, names of heads of household here in 1820. The central column are the towns where either that individual, either this person here, or their family had lived prior to coming to Westminster. And then we also have a list of their occupations here on the far side. So for the most part, we see that these are all people who had individuals in Westminster who had people of color living in their households while they were living in Westminster. So for the most part, the majority of people that I was able to track down, they come from the central Connecticut area that we've been talking about in and around Middletown, Connecticut. Some of them actually come from Middletown, Connecticut, which is pretty amazing. We can see from their these are their professions. These are, of course, the white men. They have very high profile professions here. Wealthy families. They are gentlemen. We have ministers and business owners and lawyers and a couple members of the House of Representatives, which is pretty interesting. So we can see from these records that a couple of these individuals with the asterisks here, these are families that were all persons of color. And so we have a man named W. Thomas Schuyler, I believe is probably how it's pronounced, Susanna Reed, who we've been talking about all along, and a man named John Lee. I haven't been able to find early records beyond what's in Westminster for either W. Thomas Schuyler or Susanna Reed yet, but town records in Westminster tell us that John Lee comes very specifically in 1812. The Lees, quote, were a black family that were warned out of town, and Jack Lee, or John, as we see him listed here, had been a slave in Connecticut. So that fits into the trend that we're starting to see, white families from central Connecticut coming up. And so John Lee, a black man, is also from Connecticut. And if records are to be believed, he had once been enslaved there. And so, as I mentioned in that other record, there were two men listed there who had people of color in their households who were Congregationalist ministers. And that was a man named Eliezer May and a man named Sylvester Sage. And this part of my research, I have to admit, is a little speculative, but there are lots of threads and whispers that I'm trying to putting together that make the most sense. So some of this is a little speculative at this point, but I really think there's something there. Our town records in Westminister talk about Sylvester Sage as having a woman in his household, in a woman, a person of color. Her name was Nancy Freeman, and in the 1810s sometime, she gave birth to a son whose name was George Lord. So here's the Lord name popping back up in our records again. And remember, Sage was the man. Sylvester Sage was the minister who married Eunice Reed and Montgomery Brooks in 1827. And Eunice had a son, Joseph Lord, who is presumed to be the son of this man, George Lord. So we see connections. Again, these are just not an official document that makes these connections, but these are, again, whispers and sort of these tangential mentions of the same names, of the same people coming up over and over and over again. And so how involved the ministers were in the lives of the Brookses and the Reeds, you really can't say based on these records. But clearly they knew each other. If Sylvester Sage is marrying Eunice in Montgomery, he at least knew them that well enough for that. And for other town records from Westminster tell us that there were other people of color in the town who were also involved in the Congregationalist Church. There is a record from 1816 that talks about two colored women, a woman named Jenny Lee and Sarah Sheldon, who were admitted into the East Parish Church. And presumably Jenny Lee is related to John Lee that we saw before. So again, there's still working on some other documents, trying to tie this more concretely together, but there's something there. I really think that there is. And if we expand on this idea of this connection to central Connecticut and this connection to the slavery aspect, enslavement that was going on historically in central Connecticut, it actually does make a little bit of, it makes a lot of sense. So if we go back and look at some other things going on in central Connecticut and go back to the 18th century, we're actually going to find some more of these whispers. And so we're going to start this next section with a man named Samson Occam. He was an indigenous man. He was a member of the Mohegan tribe that was located in East Central Connecticut. And remember what I said about life for indigenous people in the 1600s and 1700s, after the arrival of the Europeans. Their traditional society was thrown into chaos as they had been displaced physically, and all of their traditions had been disrupted, and so life for them was quite chaotic. And like many indigenous people of that time in southern New England, Occam converted to Christianity, and he actually furthered his studies in the Congregationalist Church under the ministrations of a minister named Eliezer Wheelock. And so Occam took it upon himself to travel around New England and Long Island and work with other indigenous communities. He was converted to Christianity, but he was very committed to attending to the welfare of indigenous people and also to promote protection of their lands. He saw what was happening with the encroachment of the English, and he really wanted to help stabilize some of the lives of the indigenous people in southern New England. And again, he had converted, but he was also a protege of this minister, Eliezer Wheelock. And the both of them spent a lot of time traveling around, doing public speaking, especially Occam, to try to raise money for what would become this Indian charity school that was supposed to be located in central Connecticut, in and around all of these indigenous people in that population there. However, while Occam was away doing one of his lecture circuits, Wheelock took those funds that Occam had helped raise, and he decided to open his Indian charity school, not in Connecticut, but in New Hampshire. This would become Moore's charity school up at Dartmouth, in Dartmouth College. And so understandably, Occam felt very betrayed by this. He became very disenchanted with working with Wheelock. And so he took it upon himself to find a different way of addressing this increasing lack of political agency and increasing poverty that he saw taking hold of the indigenous groups in New England, southern New England, and New York State. And so he helped to organize a lot of these fractured, disparate groups into a new group of indigenous people called the Brotherton Indians. And members of this group had decided to buy land in upstate New York. And starting in the 1790s, many of them moved from southern New England out to New York to settle in their own communities without the interference or influence of the people back in Connecticut. And so again, if we think about what's going on in this part of Connecticut, the southern Connecticut area, central area, right around Middletown, Connecticut, in Haddam. Haddam is another town that figures prominently in a lot of this early activity. We've been talking about that as this as a hot spot for a large enslaved population as well. So here we have central Connecticut with a lot of indigenous people, a lot of enslaved or formerly enslaved people down there. And neither of these groups are very well regarded by this Anglo-American dominant culture. And so indigenous and Black communities often started to work together. They intermarried a lot. And so by the time Samson Occam comes along and establishes the Brotherton Indians, a lot of the people who join his group are of mixed indigenous and African-American ancestry. And so these are the groups that leave central Connecticut and go out to New York State in the 1780s and 90s to set up this new colony out there. And this is the case. We find this connection to the Reeds, to the Brotherton Indians. Again, we think these are the same people. We find land records that connect a man named Joshua Waukee into the Brotherton Indians and also into the Reed family as well. But again, this is still a little speculative, but again, the whispers make it very interesting and something that I'm going to go back and spend a lot of time to really try to see if we can verify this. So how does that tie into who we've been talking about tonight? Well, we've got Eunice Brooks, Reed Brooks, who we've been talking about right from the beginning. Her mother, Susanna, who started us all off in the 1820 census. Her father, Joshua Waukee, is part of the Brotherton Indians. He and his sisters are part of a group of people that buy this land out in Oneida County, New York, and move out there to establish a new settlement. So again, this is a little, as I said, a little bit speculative, but I think that again, I think that there's something to this. So why don't Susanna and Eunice end up going out to New York with everybody else? Well, we can see here from this record that in 1812, Joshua dies, and I think he dies out there in New York. And so it's possible that either Susanna and her children were either living in Westminster at the time, and after her husband's death, they just decide to stay there, or they come up to Westminster at a later date. I'm not exactly sure, but they end up staying in Westminster. They don't go out to Oneida County. And set up their family there for the next 80 years or so. And again, we throw in the Congregationalist minister angle, that becomes very important in this because again, the Brotherton Indians, their leader, Samson Occam, was a Congregationalist minister. We've been talking about a whole bunch of other Congregationalist ministers in Westminster as well. And that man, Sylvester Sage, who had married Eunice and Montgomery, he's out there living in Oneida County at the same time that the Brotherton Indian groups are being set up. And again, I haven't been able to find something specific that has his name on it that says he was involved working with the Brotherton Indians yet, but it's very telling that he's in Westminster, he moves out to Oneida County for a little while the settlement is being established, and then he comes back to Westminster. And again, this is something that needs more research, needs to be nailed down more, but there's lots of whispers that that are very interesting, and gonna take some more work to figure out exactly what specifically is happening here. So that's all I have, and that's probably enough. I've talked a lot. So
Thank you, Gail.
Yes.
You can stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
Though I don't think anybody wants to stop sharing, because that was a tremendous presentation. Thank you so much. I want to jump right into the questions because we're running a little bit over time and there are many good questions. I'm going to try to bundle a couple of them. So two people asking, for census purposes at this time, can you really, did they distinguish consistently between Indigenous people and Black people, or were they kind of, treated as one thing? And then the one I wanted to bundle with that was, let's just take that one. So if I'm looking at the census and it says colored, am I seeing Indigenous or am I seeing Black, or both?
It could be both. A lot of it depends on the context, and that's why a lot of the background research is so revealing, because in the census records, they could show, usually they unless an individual for various reasons is associated with an established indigenous community, they're not, especially in this area up here in New England, they're not going to show up in those early census records. That wasn't even, for most of the time, that wasn't even a category that you could select in those census records. So I think a lot of people who had dark skin were just assumed to be Black, and so that's a place to start, but you have to go back and look at various other records to see, like when we started with this, we're like, oh, they must be all just referring to Black ancestry. But then when you dig into it a little bit more, you find, oh, well, it's much more complicated when you start to figure out where they're from, and that history of the area that they come from gives you a little more insight. And rarely will it actually spell it out. I mean, there are some cases where you get really lucky, but a lot of times it is they could be a mix of both too, as we see with some of these other examples too.
Someone asked right off the bat why 1730 is the start date for the larger project.
Oh, I got a cat. Excuse me.
Welcome.
Yeah, he can't wait. That because in this particular area of New England, that's when we have historic records essentially starting in this part of New England. If we were living in the coast or southern parts of New England, the records would go back a lot earlier. We just don't have records in this area that is like the 1730s is really the earliest any kind of written record that we have for settlements in this upper central area of New England.
Two kind of related questions coming in. Have you found any records of Brooks descendants in Westchester County or Rochester?
Maybe Ray can field that one.
While we wait for him to come
Sure.
in, just holler when he is ready. Someone has also asked how a question that definitely pertains here, but is also broader of how you
Oh, can
distinguish
you hear me
between.
now?
Oh, there's
Can you
Ray.
hear me?
Hey, Ray, yes.
Yes.
Yes. So the question about Rochester or Westchester County, New York.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, as far as I know, my family lived in New York. Montgomery is listed as living in the 1901 Brothertown Indian claims. My grandfather Nathan Brooks gave an affidavit saying Eunice Reed was now against it, and Montgomery Brooks was Brothertown. And some new records show Eunice being born in Massachusetts. Others show her being born in Connecticut. So in 1910, when the Montauk Indians were detribalized by Able State Judge, County New York, Abram R. Blackman, a lot of the Brothertown Indians joined the Montauk tribe, and Nathan Brooks and his sisters joined, and my aunt Eunice Brooks, they joined the Montauks in the 1900s. Oh, before the 1900s, because she died in 1906. So they belong to the Montauks, the Narragansett, and the Brothertown Indians of New York.
Thank you
But
so much.
in the town records of New Hampshire, Connecticut, they're listed as colored, black, or mulatto. Even Thaddeus Brooks and Mary Elizabeth Jackson, for some reason on the marriage record, they're listed as white. I don't know why. Maybe it helped them to get married. I don't know.
A sub theme throughout here is that, these records may seem super dry and dusty, but you can really uncover incredible stories within them, but they can be very unreliable in some ways. As you
Right.
say, Ray, sometimes someone is listed as, one thing and then another and then nothing and then something. But that's why the intensive work of really knowing, as you
Right.
both do, who is in the family can help you to
Right.
make sense of it. The related question is, do the census records distinguish between
My
slavery and
mother's side of the
servitude?
family, yeah, on my
Go
mother's
ahead.
side of the family, the Batemans, there are people that married into the Mi'kmaq tribes, but they're only listed as Indian on the tribal roll, but in town records, they're listed as black or colored, So I don't know.
I'll give that question to Gail about how the records are they showing slavery, servitude? Do they distinguish or not?
It depends on the year of the census record. The early, I don't, by 1800, I don't believe they're asking about at least the 1790. There are categories for servants, and they don't distinguish. They could be white or black. They could be indentured servants that are white. They could be people of color who are also servants in the household. And every 10 years for every census, it's slightly different. So you can't, the census records are great for some things, but they're not like a universal across the board. You do have to go and look at each one and see what specifically they're asking in each particular one, because they're interested, as they're responding to what's happening in the country. And as immigration, people start to immigrate, then they start asking about where people are from. When those sorts of things start to enter into the public dialogue, you see that reflected in the census records. So long and short answer, sometimes it tells you and sometimes it doesn't.
Sadly, the constant
Yeah.
answer. Someone noted on the deed that it was a reference to New Jersey. Do you remember?
Yes. So they were living in New Jersey at the time. So the land was in Westminster, Vermont, that it's referring to, but the person who owned it was at the time living in New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
A couple of people are asking about DNA testing. whether that is part of this exploration as well as looking at the paper records.
Not for my aspect of it. I think Ray has done some DNA. Maybe he can speak to that.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
And a lot of my family has done DNA also, and Indian does show up. But we also have Mayflower heritage on my mother's side. And these people came from Underhill, Vermont, uh, and uh, and also New York from the Herbert side of the family. Yeah, so we have African, we have Native, we have uh, Mayflower heritage going back to Samuel Fuller. Yeah.
But that isn't part of the Recovering Black History Project. Didn't do DNA.
Yeah. But
So,
my siblings have more Native blood than I do, because I found out 2 years ago through DNA that my biological father wasn't a Brooks. I still know who he was. He was actually Cape Verdean, I think, because I have a lot of Cape Verdean records. But on my birth record, Frank Brooks is my father, and I only know my Brooks family from growing up there. So to me, even though DNA says they're half siblings, to me, they're still my full siblings. Yeah. Mhm.
you have to be very careful
Yeah.
what you wish for when you go
Yeah.
investigating these
I was
things.
80 years old when I found that out. I'm 82 now.
Oh, looks like we're having a little lag on the Zoom there with Ray. Sorry about that. What is the reaction being in the area, with the local historical societies, and you must have presented, in New Hampshire around these what's the reaction today to these findings?
People are really excited. It's been so wonderful to go into the Westminster Historical Society. Ray had mentioned they were a big part when he started to do his research years ago in helping, because a lot of it, obviously we've been talking a lot about Westminster, Vermont, and they've been wonderfully excited to explore this and wanting, and anytime I show up, they have been fantastic about any records I want to see and indulging my whimsy of looking at whatever they want to know too. And it's everybody I talk to is excited about it, and I think we're just finding that more and more. The more we look, the more we find, and it's always been really well received for the places where I've presented it. People are genuinely interested and excited to find out something they didn't know before, which is wonderful.
That's tying into something someone just put in the chat, but oh, go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to say, in the book, The History and Archaeology of the Montauks by Gail Stone, they have a tribal roll which has Nathan Brooks and his sisters and Eunice Brooks in it. She's known as Mrs. Perry Roberts.
Once you know a name, when you start seeing it in so many places, it's so great. And we were
Right.
talking before this started about how many people will say to us in our places we go, like, oh, I just do my family history. I'm not a real historian. But I mean, all history is somebody's family. And you can see just by
Right.
following one family, you can uncover so much about all of our history in this place. And someone is saying that they do this kind of research in their own town. If somebody kind of wanted to get started on this broadly, I know that, it's a huge thing, but if somebody thought, well, I just want to try and do some of this local history in my town or my family, what's a good place to begin?
Well, there's going to be another presentation sort of piggybacking off of this one with the group from Monadnock, or Historical Society of Cheshire County, and the Monadnock Center for History and Culture or culture and history, who started this project that got me going. They're going to be Jenna Carroll and Michelle Stahl are going to be doing a joint presentation through Partnership for Historic Bostons in a couple weeks. And if you go to
the link in the chat.
Yeah, if you go to the events, the upcoming events for Partnership for Historic Bostons, you can sign up for their seminar, and they'll do exactly that. They'll walk you through how they set up our research structure for our project up here, and you can apply those things to the research that you want to do if you want to get started that way. And it's like this. It's a free thing. It's an evening seminar on Zoom, and it's a great place to start. Give you some tools and some tips on places where you can go and access information and how to organize it and all that kind of stuff.
And that would be a wonderful thing to attend. As Gail said, I just put the link in the chat to Recovering Black History, a workshop, April 17th, another Wednesday, another Zoom, 7 to 8:30, with Jennifer Carroll and Michelle Stahl. That can help you as you begin your journey into looking at archival material. That starts with census records that are all available for free online, all census records for everywhere in the US, all online, all for free. So, if you even know one name or one place, you can get started in that way. Other people are posting things in the chat for resources. And I'm going to put in as another broader resource, Gail's, the link to Gail's podcast.
Thank you.
The Secret Life of Death. Make sure I sent that to everybody. Not just, there we go. Secret Life of Death, where you can hear more from Gail. Just looking for a few, and as someone says, how to get started in your own town. Most towns in this region have a historical society that have town records. Those are also all online. If you go, and they're called vital records. So if you just go to a search engine and type in vital records of your town, often these are going to come up. So there are free ways to get involved, so that even by April 17th, if you're coming to the workshop, you will maybe have made a little start. Well, that is about it for our time together. Thanks again to Gail and to Ray. It's, talk about, the past is present. Here is Ray Brooks. We saw those photos of little boys in the 1880s. We saw records from the 1700s. Here he is, it goes on, which is what we all want. So
thank everybody for the interest. I thank all the viewers watching too.
And hopefully we will see more of you again at our next event. Thank you, Gail. Head to her podcast. Thank you, Ray. And thank you, everyone, for attending tonight.
Thank you, everyone.